We're in a series called Great News, where we're taking the Gospel of Mark and we're just going through it step by step. Today we're in chapter 8. Hopefully, if there's enough time, I'll read to you a little bit from chapter 14, maybe even chapter 10. But we're going to be focusing on Mark for the next couple of weeks too. And to set the tone for it, I want to share with you just once again what the first line of Mark is. The Gospel of Mark, that's what we call it, but he didn't call it that. His title for the book is found in verse 1 of the book. And it's here on the screen. It says, "The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God." Mark's title for what he was writing was that this is the beginning. And it's the beginning of a story, but it's not just any story, it's good news. It's a good news story about Jesus. And then he uses these special words, Jesus the Messiah, and Jesus, the Son of God. Today we're going to learn a little bit more about the Messiah, what that means. Son of God, according to us today, we would say, well, that means he's divine. According to them back then, it meant that he was the rightful ruler over the entire earth. That's kind of what the phrase meant for them. And we're going to unpack Messiah a little bit for us today. But here's the thing. Mark thought it was good news. He thought it was the best news in the world. He thought it was news that was worth spending a lot of money back then to get paper, parchment, and whatever else it took to write these words down. 2,000 years ago, it wasn't just something that you would walk over to the local CVS and grab yourself a pack of loose leaf. He had to go through a little bit of effort to make this thing happen. And he thought it was such good news that he wanted to get it written down. It was great news, in fact. And so the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about specifically what it is that makes it such great news. The first week, we talked just a little bit about what great news means and what it's all about. The second week, we talked about how Jesus was this mysterious character that everybody knew he was cool, everybody knew he was good, everybody knew he was doing something that was really interesting, but no one really knew who he was. His identity was kind of confusing. They didn't really grasp all that he was. More than that, Jesus kept them in the dark. We saw in week 2 that Jesus intentionally kept people in the dark. The people who could receive him for who he really was, he would reveal himself to them. But to those people who had their own preconceived ideas on what Jesus should be, he told them weird parable stories and confused them. And if he healed them, he would say, now don't tell anyone about this, just keep it all in the dark. Jesus tried to confuse people who weren't ready to receive him as he is. People who had their own preconceived ideas about what he was supposed to be. We're going to run into that again today. But last week we heard the bad news. Because see, good news is good news if something benefits you or if something benefits someone close to you. But good news becomes great news if it solves a bad news problem. And so last week we learned the bad news. In Jesus' own words, if you weren't here, the bad news is that you and I have evil in our hearts. Evil in our hearts. In Jesus' words, you didn't just make a couple mistakes. You weren't born into the wrong family. You weren't victimized. You weren't forced into those situations. In Jesus' words, that was bad. In Jesus' words, we're going to understand that he says our hearts are bad, and out of the heart flows all kinds of bad things like language. You know what I'm saying? It's the heart in me that's so evil that I can mispronounce a word and it comes out bad. That's the thing. Jesus says it's evilness in our hearts. It's not just, I made a mistake. That's the bad news. Okay, so here's the problem. If that bad news is really that bad, if you're evil to the core, if I'm evil to the core, how in the world can we possibly have good news? What's the possible good news? Today we're going to address the central symbol in Christianity, and it's the cross. We've got a cross laying here in front of us to keep our mind on it. Now, we don't have a cross on the wall. We don't have a cross outside on our sign. Sometimes people ask me, why don't you have a cross on the building out there? Or why don't you have a cross inside the building somewhere? And, you know, if you're smart, you can actually notice there is a cross in our blue ball logo. So in the blue ball logo, you just look carefully. There's a cross in there. Trust me. On your way out, you can look around and see it. It's there. Trust me. But we don't just display it all over the place. And there are a couple reasons for that I'm not going to get into today. But far too often, what we do is we take the cross and we turn it into jewelry or bumper stickers, or we turn it into something that we consider like artwork. And the cross is supposed to mean something more than that. I remember I had in high school, a friend of mine got really excited about making beadwork things, and he made a bead necklace. This dude friend of mine made a bead necklace that had a cross on the bottom, and he gave it to all of his friends, and most of us were guys. And so, I had this weird sort of thing where, what do you do if someone gives you a cross necklace? Do you hand it back and say, no, I don't want it? Because it's a cross. Are you allowed to hand that gift back? But it's made out of beads, and it's a necklace. And I'm a guy, and I'm like, so I was weirded out by this whole, so I wore it a couple times when I knew he was going to be there. And then it was like, he was wearing one, so we were like necklace buddies. And it was kind of this weird thing, and eventually I replaced it. This was my strategy, okay? We went down to Mexico for a trip, a youth trip of some kind. I was in California, we went down to Mexico, and I found another necklace that was like a cross made out of two pieces of metal that looked really, firm and solid, just two pieces, just lumps of metal. It was about that big. And so I replaced his beaded cross necklace with this other one, and then I kind of had an excuse, because I was replacing the one cross for another cross, and it was all cool, And I could just say to him, it's not that I didn't like your necklace, I just found this other one, and I can't wear two. So anyway, we turned the cross into a symbol when the cross for Jesus was an event, a moment. We're going to talk about that a little bit today, but before we can get to the event, or even understanding what it's all about, we have to ask a different question. We have to ask another question. We have to ask the question Jesus himself asked in Mark 8. Mark 8:27, Jesus begins to turn the whole story around. Up until now, he's been doing miracles, teaching nice things, telling people good stories, and keeping people in the dark. And now, he begins to turn a corner. Read what it says. It says, Mark 8:27, Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, who do people say I am? There's the question. Who do people say I am? Who do you think Jesus is? Well, they give their answers. They reply, well, some say John the Baptist. He's a good guy. Others say Elijah. Well, he's a good guy. Still others, one of the prophets. Maybe one of the old prophets kind of come back, or maybe a brand new prophet. But they think Jesus is a prophet. So here's the deal. Jesus, either you're some reincarnated old guy from the past, or you're some new thing right now, but we all just think you're cool. We all pick the coolest people we know, and we're just like, that must be who you are. The best Old Testament dude was Elijah. The best guy they knew in their modern day was John the Baptist. Or maybe Jesus is a completely different prophet altogether. But there's the idea. We've got our ideas of who you are. We've got our concepts of who you are. And Jesus is toying with them. He's saying, go ahead, tell me who you think I am. And then he switches to ask them. Verse 29, but what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? And I love Peter. Peter jumps right up to the front. He answers the question. Peter's like the dude in your class who sits in the front row, and when the teacher gets half the question out, he's like, me. Well, that's Peter right here. He's like, I know the answer. You're the Messiah. Yeah, I got that one right. Now, Jesus doesn't say anything bad about that. He doesn't tell Peter that he's wrong. He doesn't tell Peter he needs to not say he's the Messiah. What he does say is not to tell anyone else. Look at verse 30. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. Now, this is really important. When Peter used the word Messiah, he knew exactly what he was talking about. We don't so much. But Peter knew exactly what he was talking about. Let me take you back. In Genesis chapter 3, God made a promise to Adam and Eve, the first humans, by cursing the serpent that had deceived them. So here they are, they're blaming the serpent for causing all this trouble. They ate from the fruit that they weren't supposed to eat from. And God says, okay, tell me about it. And they blame the serpent. And so now God looks at the serpent and he makes a promise to the people by cursing the serpent. This is what God says. He says, they are going to have a child who will crush your head. And Peter knows that story. He knows the prophecy. He knows that God was promising to crush the serpent's head with one of the offspring of this human couple. It just took him a little while. Now Peter's looking at Jesus and he knows the promise. But that's not the only promise. God made a promise to David. To David, God said, there will always be one of your descendants on this throne. here in Jerusalem. And if ever one of your descendants leaves this throne because I'm judging the town, because I'm judging this nation of Israel, then I will bring one of your descendants back and I will put them on this throne, and there will be a forever king. God made a promise to David, there will always be one of your descendants on this throne. There will be a forever king. And Peter knew that. He knew that David had been promised one of his descendants would be their forever king. Peter knew that. He also knew what Isaiah had been promised. God promised to Isaiah, I am going to send someone who is my servant, who is going to be my chosen one. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his kingdom and his government, there will be no end. God said that to Isaiah, and Peter knows it. So Peter is putting all these pieces together, and he says, there's a promised one in Genesis, there's a promised one to David, there's a promised one in Isaiah. Jesus, you're the dude. You're the guy. Messiah simply means the chosen one, or the promised one, or the one God picked. And Peter is looking at Jesus, and he says, you're the guy. The entire Old Testament, of course, he didn't call it the Old Testament, he just called it the Bible, or the Scriptures, something along those lines. The law and the prophets is what he probably said. The entire law and the prophets are pointing to you. Jesus, you're the guy. You're the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for. And Jesus says, okay, now don't tell anyone. Which doesn't make any sense. Because if Peter got it wrong, then Jesus should correct him. If Peter got it right, you got to understand what Peter's thinking. Because see, the Messiah, if he's the chosen king, you can't be a king unless you conquer the current king. And you can't conquer the current king unless you get an army. And you can't get an army unless you tell people. And if Jesus is keeping everybody silent, what's the deal? Well, this takes us back 2 weeks. Do you remember? Jesus kept everybody in the dark except for one guy. There was one guy that he said, go ahead and tell everybody. Do you remember who that guy was? He was the dude who lived on the other side of the lake, who was filled with the legion of demons. He was wandering around in the cemetery because he was crazy nuts, and he was naked, and there were pigs nearby, and he was in a completely non-Jewish area. If he had ever heard Isaiah, it probably was his buddy, not the Old Testament prophet. If he had ever heard of a guy named Adam or Eve, it was probably not the Bible characters. And he was nuts anyway. And Jesus says to him, go and tell everybody you know